Hi, welcome to lesson 5 on the female cycle. I'd like to go back to the feedback loop here for the female and look at how gonadotropin releasing hormone from the hypothalamus is telling the anterior pituitary to make FSH in order to develop a female egg. And so we're looking at how follicle stimulating hormone causes the follicle to develop, and that little egg is on the inside of the follicle. That's where you can find it. That will be the first half of the female cycle that takes the first half of the 28 days. It is on day 14 when the little egg is ovulated and is actually essentially pushed out of the ovary. After that, the second half of the female cycle is where luteinizing hormone is telling the corpus luteum to stay around for the next half of the female cycle. Now, the reason this is all happening is that FSH, as the egg is developing, that those follicle cells are forming estrogen to prepare the inside of the uterus, the endometrium, to become more vascular and prepare for a possible implanted fertilized egg. And after ovulation, that little egg may get fertilized by a little sperm. So the second half of the female cycle, LH, is making the corpus luteum stay around in order to make progesterone, which maintains the inside of the female uterus. So as we talk about the follicular phase and ovulation and luteal phase, I want to look at this graph really close up here. And this will be the most important part of today's lesson on finishing off chapter 14. So as you can see, we're involving what happens at the brain and how it affects the inside of the ovary here, where the egg is developing. And we're looking at how the hormones coming from the brain change the ovary, and we're looking at how the hormones coming from the ovary affect the uterus. So that's what this whole picture is about, 3 different parts of the female reproductive structures. So how they work. And so let's look at these levels here. Follicle stimulating hormone is for the follicle cells to help develop that egg and do oogenesis. So a very high amount of FSH is happening starting at the beginning of our 28-day cycle, and that high amount of FSH is causing this follicular development, and the little egg is going through oogenesis and developing. At the same time, these follicular cells are the ones that are mostly making estrogen, and the estrogen is the highest here. As it grows, estrogen is getting higher and higher, and as estrogen gets higher, particularly between day 7 and 14, you can see how that corresponds with how it's building the inner lining of the uterus, so that if there is a fertilization that occurs, that fertilized egg has a very vascular place in the uterus to develop, and this inner lining of the uterus, called the endometrium, will be where the little fetus can be supplied with oxygen and nutrients for its entire developmental stage during pregnancy. So what happens at as the follicle is off and running here, the FSH can kind of take a break, but you'll notice that at day 14 there's a little peak of FSH, but there is a mega peak of LH, luteinizing hormone, and that is such a high amount of this hormone that it causes this big event to happen, which is ovulation. So if a question ever says what stimulates ovulation and that bursting through of the egg from the ovary, you would pick surge of LH. That is the the biggest stimulus for ovulation to happen right in the middle, day 14 of the female cycle. After the egg is ovulated, our LH remains the higher hormone from the anterior pituitary, and now LH here is the one that will keep the corpus luteal cells around in order for them to make this high amount of now progesterone. Now estrogen is still there. It's still going up and down here, but in the second half of the cycle, the biggest hormone that we have to recognize is progesterone, because between that 14 and day 28, it is the highest amount that is causing this maintaining of the uterine lining. So if you were to hear about what the major job of estrogen is, you would say building the lining of the uterus. If you'd be asked about the job of progesterone, you would say that would be for maintaining. You see it kind of stays constant here, maintaining the lining of the uterus. And all of this is because after ovulation, there is a 24-hour window here when that little egg could be fertilized by a little sperm. And if that were to happen, it would make its way down. It takes about a week to make its way down to the endometrium, and it has to be ready for that fertilized egg to implant. And if there is no fertilization, though, which is most of the time, the egg does degenerate, and the body knows there was no fertilization, and all hormones crash. So we see a crash here of estrogen, progesterone, and as all the hormones crash at the end, at 28 days, that is what stimulates the shedding of the endometrium, which I will now have you look over here, because the shedding is always considered to be the first 5, 6, 7 days of our female cycle. So we don't actually say that the shedding happens at the end of our cycle. We always say the shedding happens at the beginning of our 28-day cycle. So that first 7 days is the days when the endometrium is being shed, and that stimulates our FSH to kick back in and say, hey, there was no pregnancy, the lining is being shed, so FSH is now stimulated to start production of a new egg, development of a new egg. So there's a lot happening in this picture, and you can rewind and talk about it again, but these stages are what follows in the notes, just talking about those first 7 days considered the menstrual stage, the day 14 considered ovulation, you must know that. And when you're thinking of the ovarian cycle, which was our earlier notes over here, we were talking about the follicle developing. They might call this the follicular stages. Again, ovulation happening, and these would be called the luteal stages over here when the corpus luteum is around. So there is names of the stages as you go through, and you can take your notes. Here's a nice little photo of the egg being released, of ovulation, that someone photographed. There's I guess a few other ways to look at this picture. This one's showing you just visually kind of separate what's happening over here in our ovary compared to what's happening here in the uterus. So you can see as the egg is developing, the lining is building. When the egg is released, we know that's called ovulation, but it leaves behind those corpus luteum cells, which are making progesterone to maintain the lining. Developing egg makes estrogen. Corpus luteum makes progesterone. Without a pregnancy, we go back over here and we see that the shedding of the endometrium happens, that can be called the menstrual phase or flow phase. As the follicle develops, we may call that the follicular phase. When the corpus luteum is there making progesterone, we may call that the luteal phase. So we've got a number of little review videos embedded in this PowerPoint. I think they're great to have a look at. So it just gives you just another chance to see animations and explanations about the female cycle. But this is the most important part probably of chapter 14. And this wraps up chapter 14. I guess I can look at this slide one more time. This is a cross section of our ovary, and when you see diploma questions on ovaries, you have to just realize that these ovaries may be oriented backwards or upside down, and you're always looking for where you can see an egg developing and say, okay, I know that the arrow would go this way. Looking at the sequence of events, ovulation is always day 14, and our second half of the female cycle would be when the corpus luteum is left behind making progesterone. But if there is no pregnancy, it basically shrivels up to what we call corpus albicans, which means in Latin white scar, because there's not much left of it after the body realizes there was no ovulation. We don't need the progesterone to continue maintaining the lining, so all those hormones will crash and the menstrual phase will begin. All right, so important, I guess, to just make sure that both feedback loops are familiar to you, that the female cycle makes sense to you in terms of how the brain causes the ovary to develop an egg, release an egg, and the leftover follicular cells, what their job is. Remember, to begin with, they're making more estrogen, and after ovulation, those leftover cells, corpus luteum, are making more progesterone, and both of those are affecting the uterus. Estrogen to build the lining, progesterone to maintain the lining. Alrighty, that is the end of our little lesson today, and I wish you all well, and please do go on and take a look at the videos that I've embedded here, because a lot of them you will find very interesting and great. And that's it. Bye.